Hello everyone. So in our last video, we had looked at CSS, which is this new language we can use to style our web pages, changing colors, changing fonts, changing location. In this video, we're going to keep diving deeper into CSS and specifically focus on selectors, the beginning of those rules that lets us pick what we're styling. We'll look at CSS combinators, which allow us to take more than one selector and chain them together to describe contextually where on a page something is. And we'll look at pseudoselectors, which allow us to describe the state something is in, such as if it's being hovered or if it is the third or fourth of something on a page. Finally, we'll also briefly look at CSS animation, which is just one more set of rules we can use to make our pages look extra professional. So let us start by creating another website. So you can see here, I've got a pretty basic website that follows all of those same rules that we had seen over the last several videos. We've got a body that has a couple sections, our objectives, a little footer at the bottom, and it links a style sheet. You might notice this week I've started deciding I'm going to put my style sheet in a folder. This is a common pattern for larger websites as we start working with multiple files or multiple style sheets. It becomes common to want to organize things. So if you have a folder in your project, you create a new folder, name it whatever. When you're linking that code, you just put the same path from the root of your project from whatever HTML file you are in. One typical design is to put all of your HTML files in the root and then put things like styling in a folder, put things like images in a folder, put things like JavaScript if you're using it in a folder, so that these web pages on top can see everything, can drill into those folders. But if you want to find a particular thing like your styles or like an image, you know which folder to look in. So now we've got our basic website. Let's say as we were furthering this design, we realized maybe I want a different page for each of these topics. So I can go ahead and create a second web page here right off the root, and I'll call this one Combinators.html. My combinators will start the exact same way as my previous page with an HTML and a head and a body. I can even reuse that same style sheet that we used on our home page, link it to this page here. And then I decide, oh, well, in this section, I'm going to start talking about combinators. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, combinators allow us to describe contextual information about where an element we want to style is on a page. So what I mean by this is if we go and look at our home page here, we need some way to get to our combinators page here. So let's say I create myself a nav bar. So I've got a nav element to represent this nav bar. And in here I say, you know what? I've got an unordered list of pages. I've got the objectives page, and then I've got the combinators page. And whatever pages, each one of these, I'm going to make it a link. So if I want to make it a link, that's pretty simple. All I have to do is take this list item, say, oh, well, when you go to objectives, I want to go to index.html. Or maybe when you want to go to combinators, we'll go to our combinators.html. And so I can build up each different link in my website in this nice little bar on top. So if I go and I check what this looks like so far, when I cut on over to my browser, we can see, okay, I've got my web page. the basic styles that we've got show up there. And we've got these little links up here. If I click the Combinators link, it tells me it can't find it because I added an extra quotation mark. So let us cut back over to our code, clean that up real quick. There it is. It's missing right there. And now in our browser, if we refresh and then click on Combinators, it takes us to that second page. So it works. We are able to go from this page to our second page, but it doesn't look really pretty. So I'm going to come over into my main CSS in my code, and I'm going to try to style this thing and say, oh, well, you know, maybe when I am dealing with this nav list, well, I know this nav list is an unordered list. And because it's an unordered list, I can modify this thing with UL. And I say, oh, well, you know, maybe inside my UL or inside my list items themselves, maybe each one of these has a display style. And I can modify it so that instead of displaying as bullets that appear one over the next, instead, I choose to make them blocks that appear side by side. So if I want to do that, I can first say, oh, well, the list style of my list is none. That'll get rid of those bullet points. And then I can say, oh, for the list items themselves, they will display as inline blocks. And that says, oh, well, you know, each one of these should appear one next to the other. They'll be horizontal instead of vertical. So I make those two changes, and now I decide to pop back over to my browser. If I refresh, well, now they are side by side. I should probably also give them a little bit of color, a little bit of alignment to be with the rest of my sections, but immediately I notice there's a bigger problem. So I changed these items up here because I wanted to make them appear a certain way. The problem is I'm using those same tags, the UL tag and the LI tag, to generate content in the rest of my website. I've got a list of objectives, and that one, I actually want that to be a bulleted list. I don't want them to appear side by side. I want each objective we had one above the next with the little dots on the side. When you've got a situation like this, where you have two different meanings of the same tag on your website, that is when Combinators can help. So with Combinators, these different combinators allow us to specify two different meanings for a tag based on what elements are above or next to them. So in order to specify a combinator, all we need to do is put those other elements in the same selector. So as an example, here on my main CSS, I'm saying right now, every unordered list should have list style none. If instead I said, oh, well, you know, unordered lists, if they are inside a nav element, then I want them to be list style none. What I have done here is use two different HTML tags in one CSS rule. The simplest combinators just put two tags or other selectors next to each other. This is called the descendant combinator. And it says any tag 2 that is inside a tag 1. So in this rule here, I'm saying any UL that is anywhere inside a nav gets list style none. Same thing with our LIs. I could say any nav that is anywhere, or any LI that is anywhere inside a nav, I want it to get this styling. And maybe I'm also going to give it that extra little bit of formatting so that it shows up nice. Maybe I will say our background will be the same on our list as it was on our other elements. Maybe I'll say the padding here. Each item gets about 1.5 lines of text, 1.5 EMs around it in padding. If I make those changes now, if we cut back over to our browser real quick, when I refresh, notice now we've got 2 different ways that lists show up. If my list is inside the nav element, like this one up here, it shows up as a title bar, a sort of nav bar of different pages on my website. If I look down in the text, this list that is not inside a nav bar still gets that default list formatting with the bullet points and the vertical alignment. So that is the power of combinators. You might be saying, well, wait, couldn't we have done that with just using an ID? Couldn't I have just put an ID back on my nav bar here, said, oh, well, this UL is the UL ID objectives? And you are right that we could have done that. The benefit of using combinators is they allow us to describe conditions where something should show up like this. So what we gain by doing it this way is, even if I decide to make, let's say, a second navbar at the bottom of my page, I don't need to change it over to a class. I don't need to specify anything about it. Simply by being an unordered list that is directly inside a navbar, it automatically gets that formatting. And this is really valuable if we've got a situation like a caption on an image, for instance, where captions are just text right next to an image. We can use a selector combinator to say, hey, that image, because it is next to text, that means that these 2 things are related. Same thing if we've got something like a header that is right at the beginning of the section, maybe that means something to us. And anytime we've got that, we know, hey, well, the H3 that is directly at the beginning of a section, that should be a little bit different. We should treat that specially. So that is the general idea of combinators. There are a few different specific combinators that we've got. So in addition to our basic combinators, there are 3 combinators I want to show you in this video. There are actually a couple more, but the big ones that get a lot of use. First, we've got that descendant selector, putting a space between 2 selectors. This one says a tag 2 anywhere inside a tag 1. The next one that we see a lot is the child selector. So to do the child selector, what we do is we put a arrow between 2 selectors. So if I do this, the only way that this would change is I would say, oh, well, nav arrow UL, nav arrow LI. And when I do this, what I am saying is a tag 2 directly inside a tag 1. So if we go and apply these rules with just this little extra arrow here, if we cut back over to our web page and then we refresh, we can see, well, one of those rules still went into effect. If I inspect my nav here, the UL inside my nav does get these styles, because if we look at the HTML, the UL is directly inside the nav. So that selector rule does apply. However, what the child selector does not do is cascade down to all of the children of the children of the children. So our LI style did not apply. We don't get the nav arrow LI because the LI is inside an A, which is inside a UL, which is inside the nav. So what this arrow child selector lets us do is be more specific. It lets us say, well, the UL has to be directly inside a nav. So we do want it for something like that, but we probably wouldn't want it for something like our LI here. The third selector that we've got is the sibling selector. So the sibling selector is pretty similar to our child selector. We put a tilde between two selectors. And with this one, this says a tag 2 after a tag 1. This is like siblings. They're on the same level of depth in our HTML tree. If we were thinking about this as like a bunch of nested folders, they're going to be like two tags that are sitting side by side in the same folder. You would just put a tilde between the two, and then you're selecting the one at the end, not the one at the beginning. And that is an important note about these combinators, is the thing you're styling is always whatever appears last in this combinator chain. The thing that's at the end is the thing that actually gets all of the margins and the colors that you specify. So that is our topic of combinators. What I want to look at next is pseudoselectors. So what a pseudoselector is another way that we can augment these selectors to provide us with more information. So one way that we can use pseudoselectors is to target only certain elements. So as an example of this, let's say I've got my list items that are inside a section. So I've got section list items using that descendant selector, but I decide, you know what? I want each other item in my bulleted list to be a different color. I kind of want them to alternate. Turns out there is a way in CSS that you can say, oh, well, only apply this to every other element. And that is by using the nth child pseudoselector. So how a pseudoselector is formatted is after some tag, we put a colon, and then we put the name of our pseudoselector. So one of these pseudoselectors here is nth child that says if it is one of the nth children, if it is the second or fourth or third or nth or whatever number you put, like if I put 2n here, then that's going to say each other element gets some additional styling. Let's say each other list item will make it off-white sort of. Instead of being this 20, 50, 90, we'll make it, let's say 20, 70, 70. It'll be a little bit more orangish, pinkish, whatever color that is. Now, if I switch back over to my web page and then I refresh, we can see this bulleted element, nothing changed about it. However, the second bulleted element got an extra rule applied to it. So in our section, in our UL, this item, the only rule that's applying is the LI item and the UL item. The second one, however, has this nth child 2n. A way to think about the number in here is if we were counting these things, if you could put any number in n and solve that little equation the way you did in algebra class and get that number, then the rule will apply. So 2n, if it was 0, it would be 0, but we can't have a 0th element. So we set it to 1. 1 times 2 is 2. So the second thing the rule will apply to. 3, there's no way to get 3 by multiplying 2. So that one gets skipped. And we can use this to apply rules that only target, every other element or indicate every 5th, every 10th. Make it so that we have some visual distinction for our users so that everything doesn't bleed together and they can easily identify sections perhaps. It's great for things like tables, things like grids, where you're displaying a lot of densely packed information to be able to sort of swap up the colors line by line. So that's one pseudo-selector. Pseudo-selectors are actually incredibly flexible. There are a lot of different types of pseudo-selectors. To show you another example of one, let's look at the hover pseudo-selector. So let's say if I'm in my nav bar and I am hovering a list item, I can apply the hover pseudo-selector. So what this one communicates is when my mouse is sitting directly on top of this list item here, I want to apply some styles to it. Maybe I want to make the background slightly brighter. So I will say, oh, well, the background goes from this dark gray to set the lightness maybe up to 30%. Maybe I want to make the text actually readable. So I could even use the same accent color that we used on our swapping list items. And now I am saying this is a set of styles that should apply only while the mouse is on top of my item. So if I cut back over to the browser and I refresh, now when my mouse is on top of one of my navbar menu options, it changes color, it gets brighter, and as soon as my mouse moves away, it swaps back to the way that it was before. In fact, if we're looking at one of these items in our HTML, in our inspector here, we can see the second my mouse goes over it, it actually gets these new style rules. And this allows us to create websites that sort of respond to what the user is doing. It allows us to create styles that react to where the user is focusing their attention, what they're clicking on, what they're visiting. The hover style is really, really powerful at creating a website that feels a little bit more dynamic. So those are just two examples of pseudo-selectors. The general format of every pseudo-selector is you talk about the tag that you want to modify. You first use a normal selector, and then on the end, you give it some keyword that identifies a certain condition, like counting which place it's in, or whether it's being hovered, or whether it's currently the target, the thing someone clicked on a link to get to. There are dozens of these pseudo-selectors, but they all follow this same format of element, state that element is in. So now we've looked at combinators to combine multiple selectors. We've looked at pseudo-selectors to append extra conditions to a selector. The last thing I want to look at in this video is animation. So the simplest way that we can do animation is to apply it to a pseudo-selector rule as a transition. If we look at our website here, we've kind of got two different blocks that both refer to the same exact element. We've got this nav li normal block up here that says, hey, I want these nav elements to have certain default features. And then we've got this nav li hover that says those same exact elements, while they're being hovered, I want to apply some extra styling to them. The easiest way that we can animate our CSS is to just say, hey, well, when this rule goes into effect, I want there to be a transition delay. I want there to be a, let's say, 2-second transition to go from being unhovered to being hovered. And I can do the same thing in reverse. Say, oh, well, when it stops being hovered, it's a transition 2 seconds to get back there. If I just add that one extra little declaration, then now in my browser, when I refresh, if I hover over one of these elements, it no longer immediately applies that new style rule. Instead, it slowly fades in and fades out. As I hover these things, it gives me a much more gradual change to whatever block of styling rules newly applies. So it's important to note that animations do not work with every single CSS attribute. We can't, for instance, dynamically animate and adjust between being a display block and being a display inline. We can't magically adjust between having a list style none and having a list style with an element on it. CSS isn't smart enough to know how to figure out how those little dots would pop into existence, or how we would go from being in the middle of a paragraph to being our own block of content. The only values that we can animate are those that sort of have a decimal number associated with them. So things like margin and padding, those are decimal numbers. I can put 1.5 EMs or 36.4 pixels. I can put any number. So it would be really easy for the computer to interpolate, say, well, at 0, it's 30 pixels. At 100, it's 100 pixels. So let's divide it up. Halfway, it should add on half the distance. A quarter of the way, it should add on a quarter of the distance. That's easy for a computer to figure out. So it can grow and contract proportionally to how far you are in the animation. Color, as we see here, is also just a bunch of numbers. If you say, oh, well, it goes from a reddish color at this % saturation, at this % lightness, to this color, then it can really easily say, okay, well, I'm going to slowly rotate around the color wheel. I'm going to ratchet up the lightness, ratchet down the saturation. It can do that proportionally to how far you are in the animation. So that is the first thing to keep in mind, is no matter what type of animation you're doing, the only things that will animate are values that have decimal values associated with them, things that can gradually change over time. So that's the basics of animation. If you want to do a simple animation, all you have to do is apply a transition rule with a duration of time to one of your style rules here. If you want a custom animation, something that is a little bit more sophisticated, you can do that using a keyframe. So if you want to do a keyframe animation, the way that a keyframe animation works is you're going to define a special style rule here that starts with @keyframes. So this is the first example that we will have seen of an @rule, and @rules work a little bit differently than the other rules that we've seen so far. @rules say, I am describing something that isn't part of my page, but is a tool that I can use elsewhere in my page. So @keyframe says, I am going to describe some series of transitions that happen one after the next, and then I'll be able to use that in the rest of my rules. With @keyframes, we have to supply one thing after, which is the name of our animation. I'm going to call my animation the cycle colors animation. And then inside my curly brackets for a keyframe, I actually have to supply different keyframes. So if you've ever done flash animation, or you've ever done any type of traditional animation, maybe you're an aficionado of looking up like how old cartoons were drawn, you would know that old cartoon artists, they would define just a couple key frames, the still images in the animation that they thought were important. And then they would have animators go and sort of fill in all of the blanks. Keyframes in CSS work basically the same way. We specify a couple important moments in our animation. Let's say at 0% done, I want the color to be HSL 0, and then I'll say it's 30% saturation, 20% lightness, sort of a off red, a dark maroon color. And then I might say, oh, well, at perhaps 20% done, it'll be a more orangish color. So I'll go 30 steps around the color wheel, keep the animation the same, and I can define each important moment in my animation. Say, oh, well, every 20%, I'm going to go another certain distance around this color wheel, pick different colors each step of the way, and I am just defining what I think are the key moments here. I'm not specifying every single frame what I think should be happening, just building up this set of key moments in the animation here. Once I eventually get to, let's say, 100, I might realize I have not spread these things out nearly enough. So I am actually going to space them a bit better. We'll say this is 200. This is maybe 140. Yeah, that is close enough. We can see there's like a reddish, orangish, yellowish, greenish, a bunch of different colors that I'm saying in the beginning, you start at this one. At the end, you go to this one. And I could apply these to any of my normal animatable properties. I could be changing the padding. I could be changing the margin. I could be changing the width. Anything that has a numeric decimal value, I could say, oh, well, this is how this particular field changes. And now I've got a very, very verbose description of everything that I want to change, step by step by step, in my animation. If I want to actually use one of these keyframes, I'm going to need to apply it to another one of my tags. And the way that I do that is by putting it in any other typical style rules. So let's say I've got a section and I want to say, oh, well, while a section is being hovered by the mouse, I want the colors to cycle through, make that section Technicolor rainbow rotating so that someone can see where their mouse is. Maybe this is my great 90s concept of web design here. The way that I would do that is in this section hover block, I would say there is an animation that I want to play. The animation I want to play is cycle colors. And every 5 seconds, what I want to do is rotate through all of these colors infinitely. It will go to the end, start back at the beginning again, keep rotating and updating those colors. Here I am specifying this is the keyframe I want to use. And then just like with transition, I have to give it a duration. And if I want a repetition, there are different repetition keywords that we can put at the end. Now, if I head back over to my web page over here, I refresh one more time. Now, while I am hovering over my web page, I realize I changed the text and not the background text, but you can see it is sort of rotating between different colors, giving me this sort of Technicolor rainbow effect. Maybe I should make it a little bit brighter if it is applying to the text itself, but this gives us the general idea of how keyframe animations work. Going to make this change the background color, but that is animation in a nutshell. And this is a topic that we could spend hours and hours talking about. We could go into all of the different ways you can use these properties to make slick effects, have things slide into your page as you scroll down, use them to make things breathe out, breathe in, contract and expand. But this gives you enough of the syntax to get you started so that as you begin working on your web pages, you can find ways to make things look a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more lively than if it is just flat text that doesn't move or adjust to the user. One note I do have about animation though is that often less is more. In particular, animation is at its best when it is not stealing the focus away. We probably wouldn't actually want something like this cycle colors animation if we are making a serious web page. Generally, new web developers run into the problem of thinking the difficulty something is to implement, the difficulty something has to actually make the CSS or the HTML should be proportional to the focus it has for the user. So they make these 2-second bleed in, bleed out animations. They make very, very bright and eye-catching features. The reality is all of these tools that we have in web design are in service to the content of your web page. And they're often most effective when they're so subtle that the user might not even notice they're there at all unless you point them out. One great example of this is that transitions tend to be their most effective when they only take a fraction of a second. If instead of being a 2-second bleed in and bleed out, we just take a quarter of a second there, then that's still going to be a pretty noticeable animation. If I cut back over to my browser with that change, when I refresh, as I hover each of these options, it doesn't feel like this thing is immediately changing color. I've got just enough time that my eye can adjust to the thing that I'm hovering and I feel like it is getting focus, but it's not so long that the mouse is already gone before the animation completes. That's really the goal with CSS animation, is to create tiny little effects that are almost unnoticeable, but slow down so that the adjustments on your web page happen at the same speed that your users are thinking. The goal is never to make giant garish blocks. There are times and places for that. There are times that a really bright and eye-catching effect is great, especially on a splash banner page. If you've got something like a full screen image that is taking up the home page when someone first visits a website, that might be a great opportunity for a much more front and center animation. But that is just one thing to keep in mind as you are using these tools. Same thing with features like border radius. Often you don't want very large numbers. You want just tiny bits to take off the edges as you are styling your websites. So that is everything I've got for you in this video. As a recap, we looked at combinators, which allow us to combine multiple selectors together, either targeting anything inside a tag, things directly inside a tag, or things that come right after a tag using our descendant, child, and sibling combinators. We looked at pseudoselectors that allow us to place conditions on our selectors. Things like having a particular count on the page or being currently hovered by the mouse. And finally, we looked at animations, both using transition to apply all of the rules in a block when that block comes into or out of effect because they're using pseudoselectors, or using keyframes to specify all of the key moments and then applying that animation inside another style rule using the animation keyword and the name that we gave all of our keyframes. So these tools give you just a little bit more as you are writing your CSS pages. There is still a lot to cover in this language. So in our next video, we will continue with that, but I will catch you all in that next one.